Dave Chappelle and St. Augustine help us see ourselves. My daughter is never watching Chappelle's show or his stand ups. Hopefully, she'll never know they exist. Call me a prude or paint me a conservative, I don't care. I'm myself often worry how the show, along with other shows, movies I watch, may have wrapped my imagination in troubling ways. Garbage in, garbage out, they say. I also find myself troubling ways, garbage in, garbage. Wait. I also found myself 12 years after high school in the paradoxical position of independentness to Dave Chappelle. The show was all the rage when I was in high school, prompting many conversations with friends of all races. What made it so fun was repeating the ridiculous and idiotic phrases to each other. The hilarious one-liners were endless, given my absolute unwillingness to allow my daughter to even know about the show or watch Chappelle stand-up specials. Why am I thankful to him? Why, after years of soaking in the vulgarity and profanity, am I glad I watched Chappelle? The answer is simple. Dave Chappelle helped me see myself specifically by watching his show. I was led to see the tendencies and habits within my own heart, and that were quite simple racist. And when I did those things, I was a little shocked. I began to see that jokes I laughed at perpetrated a view of black people are as lazy or violent, Latinos as dirty or illegal job stealers, or Asians as bad drivers. I began to realize I had Latino friends whose parents didn't speak a lick of English, their kids being the bridge between them and the world's so-called economic promise around them. I began to realize that I viewed my black friends' lives in exotic or foreign commodity to be consumed. I began to become aware of how I responded to the presence of a black person or black people. The N-word seemed magical to white kids like me, like if my black friends ever called me the N-word, I'd be in. I began to realize that we lived in quite distance of disproportionate worlds. The one meeting place for us, however, was chapel. So how did such an obscene show pull this off? How did Dave Chappelle get a white kid like me to see himself with a new clarity, and who is now more self-critical, more willing to listen and engage to conversations with friends of different races? I think there's a simple logic to Chappelle's show, brilliantly used to Chappelle, that encourages such self-knowledge. The logic goes something like this. Create a semi-caricature scene, bring in characters that are a little too real, say the things out loud we'd rather not say out loud in a ridiculous way or by way of a self-deprecation. Make it even more absurd with some crazy addition to we all feel comfortable laughing, all dealing with the topic or theme that is highly controversial. Within the drama world, there are a category of comedic drama that is structured like this, utilizing absurdities in outlandish scenes, calling or farce. Chappelle's blatantly utilizes this dramatic method, although there's a very clear twist to it. I think that it makes it powerful. Let us see how this plays out in one of Chappelle's well-known stick block brush. War on Terror. Immediately following September 11th, the President George W. Bush was seeking retaliation on those responsible for September 11 terror attacks. The War on Terror sought to target Al-Qaeda and their leader Osama bin Laden. There are also arguments tossed about the Saddam Hussein, then director of Iraq, was amassing weapons of mass destruction because Hussein had been listed as a sponsor of terrorism since the 1990s by the State Department. Squashing him was a part of the war effort. However, no WMDs were ever found, and the arguments offered by the Bush's administration ended up being baseless covers for some other motives, which were never quite clear. Iraq's oil supply was primary goal. Altogether, there was a perfect recipe for deception and general shadiness from our elected leaders, a war against the invisible enemy. Semi-legitimate sounding arguments as well as half-baked concerns regarding national security and a public that was for the most part simply seeking revenge. September 11th, in times of crisis, Americans expect their leaders to have a clear plan of action, all while maintaining a decorum that shows that they are sincere and looking out for what's best for the American people. However, this was undermined for many by the Bush administration's war on terror, when combined with an American ethos that simply distrusts authority generally. We did not care for the British Empire very much. The result is a public that sees their leader as having a false decorum, that's simply a cover for the other motives which may or may not be good for the American people. With that context, how does Chappelle's farce play out with the skit? He takes key from the War on Terror, typically press conferences by then the President Bush or V News reports, and replaces the President and his advisors or allies with black people, but it's not just any black people, it is stereotyped gangsta black people. This is crucial to face his farce. Ush is transformed from a monotone, emotionally sterile run-of-the-mill white politician into a stereotyped black guy who speaks African American English. The comedic effects that is immediately felt with Black Bush administrative board speaking about the region of the Middle East being ripe of the regimen change. This sounds like an official sounding sentence a typical white politician would use, but Black Bush asks if he can be real, to which his advisor says, be real, son. He tried to kill my father. He then pulls down the microphone presumably that the news crews are using for the show itself, breaks the fourth wall, and shouts that African American tried to kill my father. It's hilarious because of a serious foreign policy issue has now become a personal dispute. To see a depiction of president who is so emotionally expressive and blatant in his communication, making such decisions is both funny and sharp contrast with our expectations. Or take this scene where Black Bush seeks to justify the invasion of Iraq to press on conference because of the WMDs and the Saddam Hussein allegedly has. He begins to overly gesturing with loss of body language that brought aluminum tubes. Do I have to tell you what the fuck you can do with an aluminum tube? Aluminum tubes. Do I have to tell you what the fuck you can do with aluminum tube? Aluminum. It's so funny because I think many of us would expect some complicated description of the complex military device with loads of scientific sounding and a technical language. Of course, many of us have discovered that when broken down, a very easy and layman description is actually more helpful and appreciated even from our so-called professional leaders. I can even hear it being called an extended population insiderly device or something, but the thing is really just an aluminum tube to have a leader whom we accept the professionals speak to straightforwardly is actually quite nice and relatable. Combine that with the profanity and it's pretty funny. The reporters are unmoved by the aluminum tube accusation against Saddam, and Black Bush notices that don't scare you. Fine, I don't want to say this. The motherfucker brought some yellow cake, okay? In Africa, he went to Africa and he bought yellow cake. The reporters are skeptical, with one woman pressing further. Are you sure? Black Bush stares at her incredulously for a moment and then shouts, yes, I'm sure, bitch. It's interesting to watch this skit in 2020 because I would immediately describe Black Bush as someone who tells it like it is, or speaks straightforwardly and without reservation, which is exactly how President Trump is described by many of his supporters. Wonder I wonder how much Americans would be willing to say that about a president with non-charismatic mannerisms. It's kind of attention that Chappell intends to draw out of us and get us to see. The immediate response I have as a white guy to think skit is laughter, because I'm thinking that's funny. It's not professional or how leaders should run a country. But wait, where did I get this idea of how a country should be ran? Of this says, here's how real leaders act if they truly are leaders. This is where we must see how the farce is actually functioning. As we watched the skit, the farce makes us both invulnerable and yet comfortable enough to see that a door has been opened through Chappell's brazen humor. So we wander over to the door and find a serious question waiting. Why do we privilege white ways, white mannerisms and characteristics of leadership in the way we do? Why think that politicians or elected officials should speak professionally and not like regular people? Or if they do talk like regular people, what standard of regular are we using? For me, it was a standard of regular that was privileged white culture. You say the things in a very objective and straightforward manner with regulated emotions, and every word is sterile in its description and tone. In other words, European mannerisms and habits that come from the inherited thought of European alignment, these ways of being a leader are seen as sophisticated and civilized, or even what they do say it like this, like it is. It's being said with a gritty white working class attitude, what is respectable because it is relatable to most white Americans. But this precisely white hegemony is the assumption that white ways of speaking, whether professional or saying it like it is or normative, but is the way of talking related to black Americans. Just a white leader talking ways that speaks to the shared experience of much of the black community in America. The fears has brought us to the point by creating scene in which we had stereotyped black person, and now though it's sort of running in the background while we laugh, it's at this point that the farce can really do its work. Because as we began to ask why this is funny, and we realized that what the humor is really about is stereotyped black behavior coupled with what we think is a contradiction, namely a black leader in a position of power whose actions and words do not fit our expectations. It's here that we're each being revealed to ourselves. Surely a leader wouldn't be like that, right? Do I think this is funny? Because I think it's true. We shouldn't have leaders who differ from the norm. I convinced, but wait, why would I be willing to submit to black leadership that wasn't in the mold of white European habits and practices? The truth in the farce. In these questions, it's clear that there's power imbalance. It's easier for me, a white guy, to just say, of course, that couldn't happen because here's how leaders should be, and I know it. End of story. And then I can't stop thinking about it. But a black leader may feel immense pressure to conform to such mannerisms or expectations and can't not stop thinking about it, because it's the water in which they always submerged in navigating. By ignoring the dynamic I perpetrate it, and to ignore it is to utilize white hegemony to dissolve my discomfort, squash the situation, and get back to normal. So what will we do with what Chappell's farce has given us? Will we maintain white hegemony, laugh at some hilarious skit and walk away, or will we question ourselves more and go forward through that door of ourselves which the farce has brought forth? The form of Chappell's used to deceptively simple. It's the creation of a farce, an absurd and ridiculous function, comedic scene, but what exactly does Chappelle do with his dramatic method that makes it so effective? I think that the Chappelle uses it simple but profound. The farce itself isn't quite farce. The farce was a shame. It's the old balt and switch. With the farce drawing our attention only to find the scene us is actually full of truth. The farce draws us in these absurdity acts of sort of waterslide that dumps us in the deep pool that is we now find more real and serious than we first thought. A farce is attractive because it creates conditions for vulnerability, easing physiological tension, and alternates its precisely. This that Chappell recognizes and utilizes. It certainly worked on me. Chappell has done something quite impressive in his show. He's got us to a place to potentially see ourselves, particularly white people, giving us to the chance for self-examination, even those of us who would avoid talking about racism and drawn into the show's absurdity. This is done through the farce, but not quite a farce that disarms us and opens up to the dialogue both with ourselves and those around us. Augustine on Chappell. A very famous Christian theologian and philosopher would applaud Chappell's accomplishment, saying Augustine, no doubt Augustine would have some serious criticism to level against Chappell, which I think I would be well-founded. Even so, it would be lost on him that Chappell had done something deserving of applause. He's created something with the immense potential for us to see ourselves of self-scrutinize, something Augustine understood quite profoundly. Augustine was a Christian bishop of the North African town of Hippo. He wrote a very popular book called Confessions, in which recounted his life before and after converting to Orthodox Christian faith. However, before he responded to what he understood as God seeking him, he found himself teaching in Carthage. In Book 3 of Confessions, he recalls how he was in Carthage and his soul was rotten health. I suppose that understandable if he was you're dunked into a cauldron of infinite loves. He slept around quite a lot, and yet never was satisfied because his hunger was internal, not something satisfied through mere sexual intercourse. Yet he found surprising companion in Carthage, the theater. I was captivated by their theoretical shows, Augustine says, because he found his own miseries in life played out on stage, which allowed him space experience to pleasure, concentrating with the actors in the stories. Who doesn't enjoy satisfaction of realizing you too? The theater, Augustine says, presents something that none of us would actually want to go through, yet we love to watch it as a spectator. Augustine says that by watching the scenes played out on stage, the spectator is actually experiencing pleasure from the fiction while not being called in distress and respond in compassionate. Not so with the theater, since there's no action for us to take in. No action for us to take in response to the pain or suffering or various other scenes. The fiction portrayed is not meant to spur us on the charitable or merciful action, but rather to give us an internal satisfaction or pleasure at the intensity of scenes. And why is this a problem? Because Augustine says the more anyone is moved by these scenes, the less free he is from the similar passions. The passion grips of the chains through his vain pleasure, all while keeping us from acting for the good of our fellow humans and neighbors who may be in real distress. That is quite a negative view of theater in his own day, and I don't think he's the guy who would be the first to suggest a Netflix night. Yet that would Augustine think of Chappell's show. Obviously, he was not some clairvoyant writing about the show 1600 years later before it aired, so there is no way to know with certainty and how we can ask him, since he's dead, but based on his comments on the theater, I think we can say a couple things about how Augustine might view Chapel's show, given the intense care of his theological and philosophical inquiry of himself throughout the Confessions, which reveal how Augustine sees. I think Augustine would extend a praise of criticism. First, the praise Augustine concerned with the theater was it encouraged a person towards things which were not good for them. It did this through a rousing passions and leaving the viewer to stew in those passions, never giving a guiding hand towards what is actually good and helping for living well. Not only this, but Augustine found the theater concerning because it did not pierce him deeply. Rather, it only scratched the surface and brought about strong feelings as if it were piercing him deeply. But it wasn't the fact of Chapel's actively seeks to bring us to the racism and white hegemony. Then is a good. To seek Spade, and as Spade Augustine to begin to see truthfully, he first steps towards reorienting your life towards what is good. To see our racism to have it brought before us and see it for what it is a gift that pierces us deeply. Racism is absurd, to be shown how absurd through the farce, but not quite a farce. That is the show is a gift, to be shown that our vision was wrong, that we were seeing the world improperly, is to begin the process of healing our hearts. You see, the heart of Augustine must love the right things in the right way, but it must see that the right things properly, which involves dealing with the garbage that obscures our vision. This is the problem Augustine had with the theater in the Carthage. It did not assist in clearing the obscurity of our moral vision, but maintains the veil that prevents us from seeing ourselves rightly. Chapels encourages a real seeing, and that is what I think Augustine would applaud. Now the criticism. I think Augustine, while praising Chapel for challenging the implicit racism and white hegemony white Americans participate in, would have a major criticism. The criticism could be put in the form of a question: where do we go from here? Chapel was done us the service of revealing racism at work in our social and cultural practices, that ultimately at work within our own selves. But what are we supposed to do with that? What is the goal towards which we should point our lives and hearts? There is a lack of direction at work. Chapels show a lack of positive vision of what life should be. It is easy to be negative, to openly disconstruct things, and make no mistake, this needs to be done, but not to believe things the way disservice. A positive vision, filling the void left by the tearing down, must drive us towards something, and for Augustine that goal must be objectively good for humans, not just for what we think is good for us. You might be familiar with the famous problem of evil, as it's called, modern philosophy of religion. If there was a God who is God, all-powerful and all-knowing, then surely there shouldn't be any evil in the world, since the God would be good and won't stop it, powerful enough to stop it, and smart enough to know about it. It's usually then argued that since all of those together produce contradiction, you must give up one of the three items, or give up God. It can be exciting to feel as if you finally got God backed into a corner, which, while this is interesting and can be fruitful discussion, there is a more profound problem than this one, which is often overlooked: the problem of good. Specifically, what is the concept of goodness? Is there a true objective good, or are all conceptions of good merely human projections or social constructs? For Augustine, God is the greatest and the chiefest good. Indeed, God is the goodness itself. There is no higher good, or nor is there goodness something separate from God. What it means is that God is the final goal, the resting place towards which all good things lead. Various actions and movements of human life can be more or less good, depending on the congruence with the participation of in the way of the revealed good of God. What what does all this regarding Chapel 2 things? First, there must be a positive vision towards which we move in our actions and lives. No one can live in completely disconstructed worlds because nothingness is lifeless. Second, this is positive vision. It must be accord with what is truly good for humans. Now, perhaps this second point is sort of implied in Chapel. A good for humans is to recognize that humanity within each fellow human, the equal dignity possessed by each race and ethnicity, but this is implied is not put forward as something we can grab onto and work towards. It lacks coherence and solidarity. Indeed, the lack of positive vision in Chapel shows threatens to undermine the work he does in exposing white hegemony and getting us to see our complicity in racist practices. Chapel wraps real life in absurd fiction, a farce since we come to the show recognizing the scene is a fiction. We aren't ready for the truth and reality found within the farce. I was surprised just as much as I saw my own complicity, the practices discovered within the show, specifically the way I responded to Black Rush. I didn't expect to see more of myself than I bargained for. I self had adopted habits of practice and thought they were racist and stupid white normativity. The Chapel does not offer much in the way of where to go from here. He does us service in exposing the truth, a crucial first step toward rectifying ways of life that are harmful. The first step of course correction is to recognize you're going the wrong way. Augustine, while having a major problem with the lack of goal or direction in Chapel's show, would applaud this. He knows that human heart is kept in chains by its own sinful and disordered passions and desires. Racism began my prime example to see those bonds and thereby see ourselves is the first step on the path of true freedom.